I have the pleasure of introducing Brian Gordon Olemo, who is, clap for him, y'all, clap for him, thank you. He is an author of a newly published book, Leaders and Schemers, a political, intellectual, and spiritual itinerary. So we have an author here, y'all. Get your book signed. And he is a Ugandan community builder whose work sits at the intersection of economic development, faith, and governance across the African continent. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Political Science from the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, where he studied as a Hesburgh-Usco scholar. Before university, he served as head prefect of St. Mary's College, Kisubi, and as district speaker of the Uganda National Students Association. He went on then to attend the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg, South Africa, where he served as class speaker at the 12th graduation ceremony, CEO of SAF Corp, and committee chair at the African Leadership Academy Model African Union. Motivated by the need for deeper youth engagement in African politics, Olemo founded the Fourth Generation Initiative in 2021, a platform that equips young Africans with the ideological tools to critically engage with political leadership on the continent and to evolve a common diagnosis of Africa's challenges as a prerequisite for fundamental change. He also founded Aluta Press, making publishing accessible to young Africans at international standards, and leads speaker curation and strategic planning for TEDx Smack Youth, a platform that amplifies young people launching movements from the heart of East Africa. Like I said, he recently launched his first book, Leaders and Schemers, and we will have the pleasure to really hear about his life journey and leadership and what has led him to this point. So please give a round of applause for Brian Gordon.
All right. Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's an honor to be here. I want to start by thanking my sister Andrea and my brother Biafra. I think I saw a lot of the other people as well in the organizing committee. I think they've done an amazing job, right? Let's give them a round of applause. So I was looking at the speaker lineup for this conference, and I was thinking, oh wow, I'm thinking about what my sister Andrea has put me up to. So I hope that I'll be able to share with us some things that will be useful for us as we start this conference and as we go along with it as well. So I've seen the lineup, I've seen the program, and I can promise you it's going to be an incredible 2 days of programming that we are going to have that is going to give you very concrete guidance and direction and opportunities to deliberate and fellowship about how you can be a change maker, right? But I believe that because you're already here, it signals that you're a change maker or you're already well on that journey. So instead, what I want to do with the keynote is to, deliberate with us on a very key theoretical and practical question. And that is on the question of the return to the source. Now, before we dive deep into the subjects, I want to believe that all of us here are either the sons and daughters of Africa or we are the friends of the continent, right? And if I assume that correctly, then we can proceed to state that, there comes a time in the life of every woman and man whereby we must grow up. And the signal, the indicator of growth is that we assume responsibility. I remember around 2008, my mother gave me my first lesson on how to hand wash my white primary school uniform t-shirt. And then 2 years later, I would now be going to boarding school and I'd have to do that on my own, right? And that is the indicator of growth, that you can now take care of yourself. You can now take responsibility, where previously it would be your family and your parents would have to do that. So that kind of growth and that trajectory is what brings us here today at the third NAfSA conference. The indicator that we are growing, in Africa, we like to make noise about the fact that we are young. We talk about youth as if youth is some, item of merit or, marker of, like some everlasting marker of achievement. But you see, we need to justify our being young by taking up responsibility. And I think that by coming to this conference, we are showing as young people that this is something that we can take up, that this is a platform that we can step up to, and that we are ready to take up that responsibility. Now, the question though is that what kind of responsibility exactly are we itching to take up in regards to Africa? And when I say Africa, I mean continental Africa with 54 countries, as well as the diaspora, right? Meaning Africans who are not in continental Africa. So you think about Africans in countries like Haiti, Guyana, Barbados, the Bahamas, other Caribbean countries, and, also Africans, like in this country with populations that are not predominantly African or of African descent, but they constitute what we now call the diaspora. So you think about the African diaspora in the United States of America, which you and I constitute currently, the African diaspora in Europe and in other parts of the world, Asia and the like. So the question for us today, which I want to discuss with us and want to deliberate with us on, is what is the responsibility of these Africans alive today? What is the responsibility of the Africans in the room today? Frantz Fanon, whom I assume many of us are familiar with, or at least should be familiar with, said something very instructive. But before I then get to Fanon, I think there is a deeper theoretical question that we must ask about the man. Who was Fanon? Was Fanon a Martinican? Was Fanon Algerian? Was Fanon French? Or was Fanon African? And I ask these questions just to bring us to an appreciation of the arbitrariness of national identity that many Africans like to cling so much to and to die for. Many times when we come for meetings like this, the first instinct is to identify ourselves by our countries of origin. It's not a bad thing, but to what extent do we cling to that? And how advantageous is it in driving Africa out of the current development and social malaise that we find ourselves in? So when I hear of the National African Students Association, I'm happy. Why? Because it's not the National Uganda Students Association. It's not the National Botswana Students Association. It's not the National Nigerian Students Association. It's the National African Students Association. It means that as a generation, we are growing in our appreciation of the value of continental integration. Now, back to Fanon. I believe that the true Africans and the true friends of Africa are those who spend their lives, like Fanon, for the cause of the continent. And I'll be speaking about this much more. I don't think, and you'll agree with me, that it's the pigmentation of your skin, your accent, or even where you are born, which in fact is an accident of birth or geography, which signifies how much of an African you are. Now, this point will prove important again as we continue. But Fanon said something very instructive in answering the question of our responsibility. In his magnum opus, The Wretched of the Earth, he said, and I quote, that every generation must out of relative obscurity discover its mission and then fulfill it or betray it. So the question remains for you and I today. What is the responsibility of our generation in regards to Africa? What is our generational mission? And I want to propose that the answer to this question lies in hearkening back to the goals of the African Revolution, which my brother Biafra suggested predates us. What exactly is the African Revolution about? A friend of mine likes to say that to be African in this day and age is to be in a long line of struggle. Now, if we claim to inherit the struggle of liberation from our forebears, one might be forced to ask, what is the struggle about? What are we fighting for? What struggle are we inheriting if we think of ourselves as a generation distinct from the past and charged, as Fanon said or suggested, with a unique mission that we must discover and then prosecute? Many of our forebears have said that this struggle is for freedom. So a lot of them called themselves freedom fighters. Some of them still do today. Now, freedom sounds like a noble and desirable, goal, objective to fight for. But what exactly is it? If we claim that the African Revolution is about freedom, what exactly is freedom? Now, to understand freedom and thereby the goals of the African Revolution, we will turn to the former Tanzanian president, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere. in his Uhuru na Maendeleo, Freedom and Development, Mwalimu states, freedom and development are completely linked together as are chickens and eggs. Without chickens, you get no eggs, and without eggs, you soon have no chickens. Similarly, without freedom, you get no development, and without development, you very soon lose your freedom. So, that means that these two are inextricably linked, freedom and development. So we can think of freedom is development, or freedom as development, and development as freedom. So that means that if you and I today claim to be African freedom fighters, it means that we are fighting invariably for the development of Africa. Mwalimu went ahead to delineate this development understood as freedom in three aspects. The first is national freedom, the ability of Africans to determine their own future and to govern themselves without interference from non-Africans. You can call this political freedom, you can call it sovereignty, or today, you can call it strategic security. Now, on January 3rd this year, something dramatic happened. You know, the United States went to Venezuela and they kidnapped the head of state there in the middle of the night. Now, if that possibility still holds, I remember after that event asking some of my friends whom I work with that, you know, which African president today exists that could not have been done to? And the answer is any of them could have been picked up in the middle of the night, and all that you and I will do is lament, moralize, go on social media and make noise, and then keep quiet. And that signals something, a lack of strategic security. And that means that we might have won some achievements, or our forebears would have won some achievements as far as political freedom is concerned, but then it's not complete. There's a lot of work that needs to be done. Now, the US kidnapping of Maduro, it was very interestingly named. They called it Operation Absolute Resolve. And that's quite telling because as it remains the case, if it remains the case rather, that all it takes for the president of, say, Nigeria, Burkina Faso, or Somalia to be captured is the resolve of another country, then we lack this political freedom as Africans. In short, we're not secure. But let's assume that we can on paper, that because maybe on paper we can vote for our leaders, we can make some laws, you know, still political freedom is incomplete as a dimension of development understood as freedom. Lenin said something, that no amount of political freedom will satisfy the hungry masses. And Nkrumah added that political freedom without economic freedom is meaningless. So we can have the freedom to make our own laws, we can have the freedom to live the way we want, which I'll argue we do not have. I come from Uganda, and 2 times the country has passed an anti-homosexuality act. Whether you agree with it or not is incidental to what the comment I want to make. There were factors outside the continent that intervened to overturn the laws that were passed by a sovereign parliament on the continent. That already speaks to how much you, as an African, can live the way you want in the world. But let's grant that we have that degree of freedom. It is still incomplete or impossible if we are not economically free. So, Mwalimu gave us the second dimension of development understood as freedom. Freedom from hunger, to quote him, disease, and poverty. So in Africa today, we speak of the quest for mass prosperity. The question we are asking ourselves is, how do we create sufficient wealth for all Africans and ensure the health of all Africans? It's good that my brother who spoke before me and my sister as well, they work in the health space, right? That is a very urgent issue on the continent today. How do we ensure that our people are healthy? The third dimension of freedom, or development understood as freedom, Mwalimu called it the freedom for the individual. The right to live in dignity and equality with all others, the right to freedom of speech, freedom to participate in the making of all decisions which affect one's life, and freedom from arbitrary arrest because one happens to annoy someone in authority. Now, Mwalimu attempted to achieve this task, it goes without saying, within the framework of the nation state. And after his experiment in Tanzania, he later admitted the futility of the task within the context of one nation. That means, in short, it's impossible to attain all these 3 dimensions of development understood as freedom within the context of one nation state. And history has proven it over and over again. In a speech given in Accra, Ghana in 1997, Mwalimu had this to say in recognizing the missed opportunity that his generation, the first generation of African leaders, had at independence and that has set the task for subsequent generations that would follow. He said, and I quote, "Together, we the peoples of Africa will be incomparably stronger internationally than we are now with our multiplicity of unviable states. The needs of our separate countries can be and are being ignored by the rich and powerful. The result is that Africa is marginalized when international decisions affecting our vital interests are concerned or are made. Unity," he added, "will not make us rich, but it can make it difficult for Africa and the African peoples to be disregarded and humiliated. And it will therefore increase the effectiveness of the decisions which we make and try to implement for our development." So, Mwalimu understood, though late, that political freedom within the context of the nation state will not suffice as the harbinger of development. The work therefore now falls to us to finish the aborted project of Pan-African integration. True Pan-Africanism, that is. So, the objectives of the African Revolution have not changed. Only the generation responsible for advancing them has. And the task, as it were, now falls to you and I in this room today. Kwame Nkrumah called the task that we have today fighting neo-colonialism, or in other words, fighting to achieve what he termed as real independence, which can be contrasted with nominal independence. That is, independence only in name. By this he meant that we're not really independent if all we have claim to is a flag, an anthem, and a government with people who look like us, but we have no substantive control over our economy, our resources, and our destiny. You know, sometimes when I talk of neo-colonialism, a lot of people like to go, "Oh, these Africans, look at them again." They like to blame other people for their problems. You know, face up to your problems and do what you have to. You know, colonialism happened 60 years ago. Move on. Now, I'm all for moving on. But as we move on, it helps a great deal if we know who and what we are up against. Think about this. Right now, the Trump administration is signing bilateral health agreements with more than 20 African governments, trading continued health assistance for the private biological data of African citizens, with no guarantee that those same people will ever benefit from what was developed with their own bodies. You know, you remember during COVID-19, how the continent, I remember I was listening to one African president, the president of South Africa, share how during the pandemic, they had to go and beg for vaccines. So we are still begging. A friend of mine calls this condition extraversion, and that means we depend on the external for our forward march. That means that, by and large, the second and third freedoms that Mwalimu Nyerere spoke about is lacking, so we still have work to do. Now, the African Revolution has two potential enemies, and who are also potential allies. You know, Amilcar Cabral, I realized that when we were at the desk today that there's a brother called Cabral, you know. That's quite a big name. Cabral used to say that rice can only be cooked inside the pot, you know, but there is the external dimension. The firewood is important, the fire is important as well, right? That means for the African Revolution, we have both the external dimension that we have to think about and then the internal dimension. So we have potential enemies and potential allies. Those within, you know, who use the state for their personal advancement. You know, again, my sister mentioned at the start the book that we recently wrote. We call those people schemers, people who use the state to advance their own personal interests through corruption, promotion of tribalism, war. You know, those are the schemers. Those are the internal enemies of the African Revolution. Then externally, obviously, we have imperialism that aims to remote control the African story and African history from the outside. Now, back to where we started from, the question of the return to the source. I attended the African Leadership Academy in Johannesburg. ALA is a Pan-African boarding school that gathered young Africans from across the continent and dared to ask a serious question. How do you train leaders who will actually have an impact in Africa? Now, it's a question that sounds simple, but it hides enormous complexity. The Academy wrestled with this question institutionally. To give you context, up to 2024, ALA had a formal expectation. We actually signed an agreement when we joined the school that we would, upon our 25th birthday, or after our graduation from institutions abroad, return to the African continent to have an impact there for at least 10 years. Now, the logic is straightforward, that because the continent has invested in you, you owe it to them to go back and to invest in the continent. Now, I raise this not to settle the question or not to reconsider it, but because I believe that that same dilemma is in one form or another alive in this room today. And it's the dilemma that makes the question of the return to the source not merely philosophical, but urgent and personal. Now, we have the Guinean Amilcar Cabral, one of the leading theoreticians of anti-imperialist struggle and the former head of the PIAGC in Guinea-Bissau, to thank for this phrase, the return to the source. Now, Cabral was writing about a class of people whom he knew intimately because he was one of them, the educated African, the indigenous petite bourgeoisie, the person who has gone to school, acquired the language, the credentials of the colonial power, and found themselves suspended between two worlds. He did not mince words about the condition of this dislocated class. He said, and quote, "They are prisoners of the cultural and social contradictions of their lives. They cannot escape from their role as a marginal class." For some of you, this feeling may be relatable. You're African enough to feel the pull of home and educated enough to have the options that most of your people do not. You're black enough to be reminded of it daily in this country and credentialed enough to be in rooms where that reminder takes on more subtle forms. You do not fully belong here, and after years away, some of you are no longer sure you fully belong there either. You carry two worlds inside of you, and for some of you again, or some of us, I might say, you feel at home in neither. Now, I've spoken before in another platform about the belonging handicap that residing in what I called high castles does to one. That particular burden carried by those who have been formed in institutions meant to train you to act meaningfully on the world, and how all those privileges that you amass in these spaces can slowly erode the certainty of where you stand and for whom. Now, Cabral named this as a structural condition. It's not a personal failure. It just comes with, when you think of structure, they're not based on personal choices. It's just a road that you have to walk, right? So he wrote about the marginality of this class, both in his own country and outside of the country, in the diaspora, which he described as establishing, a territory of coloniality, producing what he called a frustration complex, a feeling of bitterness that breeds and develops as the educated African becomes more and more conscious of the compelling need to question their marginal status and to rediscover an identity. Now, I'll try and cut these things short. Cabral later, of course, says that this group, we look back home, we look back to the people on the continent to try and cure this complex of frustration. Now, so that means the longing for the source is the sharpest in those who feel most cut off from it. I've lived in Baltimore for a bit now, just a couple of months, and I've met a fair amount of black people born in this country who feel like they don't belong here. They feel, even if they have never been there, that somehow they belong in Africa, that somehow they belong to Africa. So these are the questions that I'm talking about, just to make it less abstract, right? It's the question of the return to the source, the question of identity, because once we can resolve this question, then it will help us to know how to act, right? So it's both having a practical significance, and of course, it's also a very important theoretical question, rather. So if you're sitting in this room and you feel that tension, that pull, that unresolved ache of not quite belonging anywhere, I want you to know two things. One, you're not alone. The second is that you're experiencing a structural condition that Cabral diagnosed over 50 years ago. Now, as an African, you need to see that this condition, this frustration, is something that must not infantilize you. It's something that must fuel you to act decisively for the future of the continent, just like Cabral and his generation did when they decided, after gathering in spaces like Lisbon, to re-become Africans, in his phrase, to re-conscientize themselves and to then return to the source. But Cabral was careful here, and we must be careful too. He was clear that the return to the source is not, to quote him, and cannot in itself be an act of struggle against foreign domination. And it's no longer necessarily a return to tradition. It no longer necessarily means a return to traditions. It's a denial by the petty bourgeoisie of the pretended supremacy of the culture of the dominant power over the dominated people with which it must identify itself. Now we'll unpack this slowly. In other words, what he was saying is that the return to the source is not nostalgia. It's not performance. It's something more demanding, something more liberating. It's the decision to identify completely and without reservation with the people and their struggle. To take the frustration of your marginality and to convert it through discipline and commitment into the energy required for transformation. And that's what we're here to talk about as we open this conference. How can we be useful to Africa? Now, I'll just describe some things that the return to the source is not, so that we can talk about what it is, right? Now, I'm going to talk about 3 counterfeits of the return to the source. Things that pass for the real thing, but they are not what it is. The first counterfeit is empty symbolic gestures disguising as cultural purity. And you find this a lot, even with Africans on the continent. The fixation over so-called African names. African dressing. I watch YouTube sometimes, and there's a comrade who likes to parade around the world wearing hides and skins and a headdress, and he feels like he's the most authentic African there has ever existed in the world, just because that's how he dresses. I say good luck to him in the winter here, because you can't wear those things there at that time. So is the authenticity of being African determined by what you're wearing? Because I think there's a risk of us cheapening the African Revolution and reducing it to kente clothing that we buy on the cheap from Temu or Amazon. And that's what makes us feel like we are the greatest Africans that ever lived. Or because sometimes maybe you bear the name of your... I have a group of people that I work with at the initiative, and they keep telling me, no, we have to change our names. Oh, colonial names. Now, my names don't help. Brian, Gordon, these are British names, right? But are we missing something with that fixation on those things? So you can see the shallowness in such practice, because you can carry the name of your ancestor, but do you carry their spirit? You can some people carry very huge names, but your ancestors are turning in their graves because you're not reflecting what you ought to be reflecting with that name. For those of you, I always have some fun with my friends. I meet a lot of people that are called God will, God send, evangelist, and there's nothing of God about them at all. Or in Africa, there's this running joke about how if your country is not democratic, what do you call it? The Democratic Republic of, you can fill in the gaps, right? So it's not in the name, right? It's in the spirit that you carry. It's in understanding the mission that you're charged with and being able to deliver it. So nobody should pressure you about the name that you carry, because that is very incidental to the tasks that we are dealing with. It is Fred Hampton who, when he was deputy leader or deputy chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, who said, power does not flow out of the sleeves of a dashiki. So wearing a dashiki is not what makes you an authentic African or what makes you a freedom fighter, right? So the African Revolution, as I mentioned, we can't reduce it to those things, right? So cultural performance without political commitment is not resistance. At best, it's a decoration. And decoration, however beautiful, does not free anyone. It's like having a Bible on your shelf that you never open. I can assure you it's not going to ward off any evil spirits. It's not going to help your life, because it only profits you if you actually go and open it. Now, so the second counterfeit is to think that the return to the source is a return to some Africa of the past. And this is the more sophisticated trap. In the immediate pre- and post-independence period, its greatest expression was Negritude. Negritude was born from genuine pain. People like Emi Césaire, Leopold Sédar Senghor, Leo Gontran, Damar, these were serious men responding seriously to the violence of colonial dehumanization. To assert that African civilization had beauty, value, and depth where the colonial world had denied all three. That was a necessary act, Negritude, that is. It had a particular historical intervention. But let me say something plainly. After all the work that Nkrumah, Fanon, Martin Luther King in this country, Malcolm X, and a couple of others have done, I do not think we have an obligation to prove to anyone again that Africans, or black people for that matter, are human beings. That work has already been done. The battle has been fought, and it has been fought at tremendous cost. To still be organizing our intellectual and political energy around the project of proving our humanity to those who denied it is to remain trapped inside a framework that our forebears already transcended. We owe them more than that. I think we can all agree that we have better things to do with our time. Negritude then is not our present condition. It's a relic of a particular historical moment, a necessary phase in the long arc of African and black political thought, but it's a relic that both Africans on the continent and those in the diaspora still flirt with. You see it whenever the assertion of cultural identity becomes an end in itself rather than a means to liberation, when we try to make it look like African culture, which is in fact fluid, is superior to any other in the world, whenever energy that should be directed at structural transformation gets redirected into the performance of authenticity, whenever we are more concerned with being recognized as African rather than with doing the work that African freedom actually demands. Fanon, again, who understood the Negritude impulse from the inside because he lived it, saw the trap clearly. He argued that Negritude ultimately freezes culture. It treats African identity as a fixed essence waiting to be recovered from the past, rather than as a living thing made and remade through the struggle of actual people in actual history. Culture, I want to just state, before we begin our discussions, is not a museum piece. It's not preserved in amber somewhere waiting for you to come home and collect it. It's built in the heat of collective action, in the friction of real struggle, in the daily lives of people working to be free. Culture is being made everywhere, including here at this conference. Now, the third counterfeit is opportunistic careerism. Now, this is one of the quietest ones rather, and perhaps the most dangerous, because it does not announce itself immediately as a betrayal, but it presents itself as achievement. Let me illustrate. You go abroad, you get the degree, you acquire the credential, the network, the accent, and then you return home, not to serve, but to be served. You return home to leverage what you've learned into a government appointment, into a consultancy, or into a position of influence. You use the language of transformation while in private pursuing the logic of personal advancement. In my book, I call these people schemers. Cabral called them something similar. Those who use the National Liberation Project as a vehicle for class ambition rather than collective transformation. They are unable to commit fully to the people because their material interests run in the opposite direction. The question is therefore not whether you'll have a career. I'm sure all of you here, being the brilliant people that you are, you will. The question is what your career serves to advance. That means that we have to subordinate what we study, what we build, and what we become to the needs of the African Revolution. And that starts with this conference right here. I'll just close my comments by talking about how we, as the African diaspora, can contribute to the advancement of the African Revolution. In short, how do we return to the source? To start with, all of us have credible reasons to be here. It could be your education, it could be economic opportunity, culture, faith, fellowship and intercourse. Some of you may argue that you're called to contribute in the diaspora, not in continental Africa. Some of you may say, okay, Africa is too small for me, and there are other credible causes around the world that I want to contribute to, Ukraine, Palestine, Iran, etc. But and I know that the African diaspora contributes significantly, even in terms of remittances and things like that, to the African continent. But the question we must ask ourselves is it enough? Is it enough to send money home? Is it enough to make noise about African politics from the outside in ways that sometimes hurts the continent? History suggests that this is not enough. And there are a lot of historical examples that we can point to. I'll close by just talking about three things that the return to the source demands. And I'll be very concrete and fast about it. The first is that the return to the source demands that you perceive of yourself as the expression and the vessel for the dreams and aspirations of your people. This means that you seriously have to ask yourself whose hopes you're accountable to and whether the choices you make day by day are answerable to those people. We must identify completely and be at one with the hopes and aspirations of Africa. As Sekou Touré put it, to take part in the African Revolution, it's not enough to write a revolutionary song. You must fashion the revolution with the people. Biko added that in order to achieve real action, you must be a living part of Africa and her thought. So as we go along this conference, let's ask ourselves, are we a living part of Africa and her thought, or you are simply a spectator? That means that you and I are not exempt from the intellectual obligations that comes with being a child of the African continent. If anything, that obligation is more intense for us. Number two, the return to the source demands that we forswear convenience, that we commit, in Cabral's phrase, class suicide. Now, I'm one of those who believes that being in the diaspora, I'm not one of those rather who believes that being in the diaspora gives you an easy life. There's this mistaken assumption, especially in Africa, that everyone abroad is enjoying life, that you have it easy. So if most of you come from these countries, you see people asking for money left, right, and center because they believe that you're the richest people that ever existed. But I think that we are all privileged in one form or another. And with privilege, it means that we have to justify it. At ALA, we used to say, do hard things. That's the price you pay for privilege. We must do hard things. This conference is a hard thing. So this is not a call to misery, but it's a call to intention. Because if you're a freedom fighter, as Malcolm X said, if you're not willing to die for it, then you must take the word freedom out of your mouth. So to prosecute our historic mission, you must militate against your conveniences. We must advance along with the rest of the continent. So the choice is clear. Are we going to lead or are we going to scheme? Are we going to identify ourselves with the goals of the African Revolution, Africa's protracted struggle, or you're going to identify with your own goals? The last point is that the return to the source demands that we act critically and consciously, because in the final analysis, you cannot change what you do not understand. And this is where NAfSA's vision is very important, to foster the development of conscious leaders who contribute to the economic, social, and cultural advancement of the African continent and its people in the diaspora. This is key. The key words here are conscious leaders. That means to be the vanguard for change on the continent, we have to conscientize ourselves. We have to build a critical awareness of the challenges that we have to tackle. Conscientization is where the return to the source starts. One cannot fundamentally change what one does not understand. And this is why this conference is very key and very important. So Cabral himself modeled this with his comrades, the first generation of African leaders. They went abroad, they drank of the cup of Western education, and they used it in service of the goals of African liberation. So the questions left unanswered by that generation and the third generation in power today await you and I. How do we ensure mass prosperity within a global capitalist order not designed for African flourishing? How do we think our way out of aid dependence? What does real independence look like in our specific conditions? How do we build the intellectual and ideological infrastructure that turns our youth population that Brother Biafra was talking about from a demographic fact into a genuine asset? These are the questions that the fourth generation must take up. As I close, I want to be honest with you that what taking these questions requires is hope. Hope not as a feeling, but as a discipline. Because despair is not a political program. You cannot organize towards a future that you do not believe is possible. So I'll close with Fanon, that every generation must discover its mission, either fulfill it or betray it. The generations that came before us discovered theirs, they fulfilled it. They paid the price for a future that they would not live to inhabit. We are living in that future. We are the answers to the prayers of our forebears that they did not live to see answered. So the question is, what will we do with this heritage that we have? So the return to the source is not a flight home. It's not a dashiki. It's not a conference resolution. It's the daily disciplined decision to be at one with your people, to be their vessel, or to be the vessel of their hopes, to forswear your convenience, to conscientize yourself until your understanding can inform your praxis. And that work belongs to you and I today. It begins now in this room, in these 2 days, and in every choice you make when you walk out of this building. Aluta, continua. Thank you very much.